Welcome to the Orange County Forum, where newsmakers keep you informed about local, national, and global issues that impact Orange County today.
Good afternoon. My name is Owen Holmes. I'm the Associate Vice President for Government and Community Relations at Cal State Fullerton and a proud alum of the institution, also a member of the Orange County Forum Board of Directors. We are extremely honored to have Congressman Royce as our featured speaker today, and it is my distinct honor to introduce him. Congressman Ed Royce, now serving his 12th term in Congress, is the 39th District's distinguished representative. In addition, he is also one of Cal State Fullerton's most distinguished alumni. Since day one in Congress, he has immersed himself in global and foreign policy issues that significantly impact the United States and Orange County. As a longtime active member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, he is known for his knowledge of world regions and foresight into U.S. foreign policy areas. He has also served as chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Non-Proliferation, Trade, and a member of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. In 2013, as a direct result of his knowledge and leadership in these areas, he was chosen to be chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Most recently, according to the Washington Post, a study, the congressman was named as one of the most effective Republican members of Congress. All of us who've had the good fortune of working with him know that to be a true statement. So let's give him applause on that. I also want to say a personal issue. I met the congressman years ago when I was a Sacramento Policy Seminar student in his Senate office in Sacramento. My life hasn't been the same since, in a good way. Congressman Royce.
Thank you very much, Owen. Appreciate it. Well, one of the goals that I have long had in Congress is to try to figure out a way in which we can bring together members of the committees and make the focus not just on foreign policy, but also on how we can speak with one voice. And I just wanted to congratulate the forum here after 25 years for giving Orange County a voice and a strong voice. So thank you all for your continued involvement with the forum. And just to share with you some of my thoughts on this, because it's been a great honor for me. It's the 3 years now that I've been chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And my initial goal was to bring together the members of the committee and sort of have it be driven from the bottom up, but with an understanding that there was originally a concept for how the House of Representatives was supposed to work, the decorum, the way we would treat each other, the way we would compromise to move legislation. And part of that is to allow every individual on the committee to be engaged, to be involved. And that is what I do on the particular committee that I chair. And as a consequence, we have had quite an impact in terms of the amount of legislation we have pushed. As you may have noticed, there is a lot of dysfunction in Washington, but in this particular committee, we've driven a lot of policy right to the President's desk, 4 bills in the last 2 weeks that the President's signing, including one today that is my legislation on North Korea. And this is not as easy as it looks, because it's been about 10 years for me working on this issue of North Korea. I've been in North Korea. In 2005, I worked with then Undersecretary of the Treasury Stuart Levy on an idea. We'd been over to Macau, where North Korea at the time was counterfeiting $100 US bills. And Stuart had this idea over Treasury that basically this was an aggressive act. So he could act on this and freeze the accounts, the bank accounts of any bank, such as the Banco Delta Asia, that were using funds, ill-gotten gains, that the North Koreans used for hard currency. And so he did that. And we had written a report. In 2005, I put out a report to Congress urging action on this, urging this approach. The legislation that is signed, will be signed today by the President, builds on Stuart Levy's work and my work, trying to put together a way to force the Kim Jong-un regime in North Korea to make a decision on whether it wants to face economic collapse or real compromise on its nuclear program. And the reason I say economic collapse is because the regime cannot exist without hard currency. And that hard currency, much of it comes from illicit activities. And much of the rest of it comes because of the Kaesong industrial plant project that the South Koreans run up on the border. Now, South Korea, we've been working with them, and they've shut down that program. Japan shut down with its sanctions regime, has now cut off the flow of currency, any currency back into North Korea. With this action today, it will not only cut off the currency used for their weapons program, but it will also put in place a new strategy with respect to the regime itself. We took a case to the United Nations a few years ago. I championed legislation to try to basically have a special inquiry. And this special inquiry and finding out of the United Nations accuses the leader of North Korea of crimes against humanity for what he has done to his people. And what we're going to do with the legislation is also broadcast information in with the same strategy that Reagan used in the 1980s into Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. A strategy which is intended to give people the real information in North Korea about what their regime has done to them, is doing to them, and the need for change there. Because this was the discovery back in 2005 when we had an opportunity to talk to those coming out of North Korea who defected, including the Minister of Propaganda, and including those who had worked on the missile program. Not only did it shut down their missile program, they had been buying clandestine gyroscopes made in Japan to perfect their weapons. But not only did it shut down the whole line because they didn't have the currency, but he could not pay his generals. This is not a good position for a dictator to be in. And this is why every single subsequent meeting with the State Department started with these words from the North Koreans: when can we have the sanctions lifted? Now, they were willing to promise anything to get the State Department to lift those sanctions. And unfortunately, in exchange for a promise, the State Department forced Treasury to lift the sanctions. That was a blunder. We are now in the position, fast forward, to them restarting their plutonium program, shrinking, the warheads, shrinking the atomic warheads so they can put it on a missile, and now a 3-stage ICBM that can hit the United States. We're now at the stage where we really do have to take action. We don't have other options. And working with my colleagues over the years on these hearings, we were able to pass this out of the House of Representatives with a vote of 415 to 2. We passed it out of the Senate with a vote of 96 to 0. I am hoping that this will get us to understand a strategy which I would suggest to you has long had tremendous effectiveness, and that is the strategy of sanctions against regimes which are totalitarian, which are a direct threat to the international community. And I would give to you the example of South Africa under the apartheid regime as an example of where these sanctions absolutely worked, and where it took 3/4 of the Congress to overturn the position of the administration in the House and the Senate, I think 80% in one House, in order to lay out the idea that South Korea, that South Africa, which had then developed nuclear weapons, and also was pushing apartheid and refused to release Nelson Mandela. I want to share with you that within a month of passing those sanctions, the South African regime, the apartheid regime, was at the table talking about elections, having released Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison. They were also handing over to the IAEA, the international inspectors, their nuclear weapons program, their bomb. I would also share with you that, in my opinion, the work that we did on sanctions on Iran, and this was an area where we repeatedly passed legislation only to die in the Senate, but finally, with Senator Kerry moving from the Senate over to his position as Secretary of State, allowed us to get the legislation, the tough legislation we needed, through. We saw in very short order how that forced Iran to the table. Now, we have differences of opinion about whether or not the agreement that the administration circumvented the Congress with, and frankly, circumvented not only the Pentagon, but also the State Department with, and did separately, whether or not that was a truly effective agreement. But the bottom line is this: the sanctions did get the Ayatollah's regime to the table. So this type of an approach is less confrontational than other options. It is something that we need to consider now. I've just passed legislation into law on Hezbollah, which will sanction Hezbollah. Our great concern right now, as many of you know, is that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, will have at its disposal $100 billion. And in the dispatches that they've already sent that have been made public, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, you can see their threats to transfer the GPS positioning capability to the 100,000 weapons that are at the disposal of Hezbollah. So we have to have an iron wall or an ironclad system where there can be no transactions with any regime around the world and Hezbollah right now. Because if Hezbollah gets their hands on this type of weaponry, which can certainly, you know, if you're sitting there, if you're a young radical and you've got that joystick which you can now target the tallest building in Tel Aviv or the airport or, you know, any target. This is a very different thing than the dumb rockets that I've seen, you know, come up and over. I was in Haifa during the Second Lebanon War, and Hezbollah was firing those things off every day, and they were slamming into the center of town. There were 600 people in the trauma hospital. But nevertheless, they couldn't hit a specific target. Imagine for a minute the targeting capability that is being threatened to be transferred here. We have got to shut down Hezbollah's ability to do this. And there's a second commitment, which Iran has now made with its ill-gotten gains. It now says it will help Hamas rebuild the tunnels. It will help Hezbollah also build tunnels, and it will transfer weaponry in Gaza to Hamas. So again, with the legislation which we've passed, we now set up a new, shall we call it deterrent, for Iran to consider this. The other issue we're working on is what to do in order to actually have an effective implementation of the agreement, because as you know, Iran is already saying, we don't agree with the reading that says we can't transfer conventional arms for 5 years or can't be involved in our ICBM program until 8 years. As a matter of fact, the Ayatollah said it's every military man's responsibility in Iran to figure out how to help us mass produce ICBMs, which may not have been all that concerning if he didn't finish the theme, you know, with these chants of death to America, death to Israel. Someone once asked John Kennedy, what is the difference between the ICBM program that the Russians, the Soviets are running, and your own space program? And he had a one-word answer. Kennedy said, attitude. And unfortunately, it's the attitude we hear from the Ayatollah that makes us want to make certain that we actually enforce this agreement, that this trust but verify thing really becomes an honest verification. I will just tell you personally, when I heard that there were going to be international inspections, I always thought it was going to be international inspectors who did the inspections, not Iranians doing the international inspections. That was kind of a curveball to me. So this is the kind of oversight, and I think we've got good agreement on the Republican side and on the Democratic side on my committee of the necessity of doing this. I will share with you on ISIS some observations, and and Owen Holmes will tell me as soon as I've gone over my time here. But on ISIS, early on the committee, we looked at what was happening in Raqqa. We looked at ISIS's model here, and we had suggested that when they came out of Syria and went over the border into Fallujah and began their attacks, and they took 14 major cities, we had suggested that the U.S. use air power back when they were on the open desert, at a time when you saw these black flags flying on these pickup trucks with the soldiers inside. I mean, this was an inviting target, in our view, and we should hit them then. We went a full year without a decision being made by the commander-in-chief to authorize those attacks, and it only came when on Yazidi Mountain, you know, the Yazidi people were being massacred, and I think early on we should have used U.S. force in order to take them out before they took these targets. The reason, and I'll just quote our ambassador from Iraq, but he raised these concerns. The reason many, like General Petraeus, were worried looking at this from a distance was because Mosul held the central bank of Iraq. And so if they took Mosul, ISIS would become the most well-heeled or, you know, affluent terrorist organization in the history of terror. And they did take Mosul. They took the central bank, and as a consequence, as you know, they can pay for anything now, including foreign fighters. And the problem with allowing your adversaries to run up a string of victories for many months, I passed legislation out of the committee, for example, my bill to arm the Kurdish soldiers who are fighting ISIS. It's a 650-mile front. 30% of those fighting ISIS are women. They're female battalions. They're fighting with 40-year-old weapons. They have not been given anti-tank weapons or artillery or long-range mortars because the government in Baghdad, frankly, is a Shia-led government, and it is not anxious to share or pass on any weapons to Kurds or to the Sunni tribes. Likewise, the Sunni tribes have been pushed out of their villages too. And so the other initiative we're pushing, with the help of many in the Pentagon who view it this way, is to arm those who are pushed out of their villages to go back in, because the idea of having Shia, you know, forces led by the Quds forces out of Iran go in and take these towns, this creates a lot of blowback, a lot of problems. So let me just quickly wrap up with respect to ISIS, and then we'll go to questions. I think we have to arm those who are doing the hard fighting up there on that 650-mile front, the Kurds. I think we've got to work with the Sunni tribes and give them the armaments and encourage them. They want to take those villages back. I've had 3 meetings with the Kurdish tribal leaders from the area, and we need to give them the air support they need, and our special operations people on the ground should be able to coordinate these activities, because if we don't roll ISIS back, then they're going to continue to transmit this message that they can't be stopped, and they're going to recruit young men from around the world, not just there, but some 12 other countries where they're operational, in order to join the fight under the presumption that they can take on the international community and not be whipped. And now is the time, long past the time, to show that they can be destroyed. Let's go to any questions that you have.
As voters, what should we be listening for from the many talking heads running for presidency? What should we be listening for when they talk about foreign affairs? A lot of them are, you know, they spat off names and countries, but as voters, what's the clue that we should listen for, that someone really knows what's going on and will be a good commander-in-chief?
Kate, I'd see if they have a vision for how to rally the country behind policies which are in our strategic national interest, but are well thought out, well thought through. All right? Other questions?
How can the millennial generation, which is my generation, prepare to be leaders and shift the conversation of international politics in a way where we can be creative in combating these obstacles of the future? So what should our vision be? What should our strategy be in combating the future issues of the future generations?
You know, it's kind of a complicated question here, but one part of it is I think, being willing to see the world the way it is, rather than necessarily the way we would want our ideology or, to tell us it is. The world is as it is. And it is tremendously challenging to come to grips with that, because that means that it doesn't quite resemble, if you go up to the United Nations, you'll see this. We understand the theory, but when you're up there and you're watching the operations, you're suddenly sort of appalled. And the first question I would have is, what can we do to empower people, other millennials, not here but all over the world? In Africa, there's the One campaign. There are campaigns going on the ground right now in Africa that circumvents the leadership and goes right to civil society. And I saw the impact of that. I'm the author, along with Charlie Rangel and others, of a bipartisan bill called the African Growth and Opportunity Act to take down the trading barriers and give Africa access in exchange, to the international trading system. We've tripled trade with Africa since. But part of that was forcing these governments to set up independent courts, independent judges. And you can imagine that this was not popular with heads of state, but it was with millennials. It was with young people and civil society. And we've got an initiative right now, Electrify Africa, a bill of mine that's passed and is signed. And Electrify Africa will, again, empower people to have access to the grid. For those of you who've ever contemplated what life would be like without electricity or constant power interruption, if you've ever, I used to be in business. The reality is that if you had to have a backup generator, can you imagine what that would cost you a month? And that's what you have to have if you're a businessman there. Imagine trying to study by kerosene and what that would mean to your sisters or brothers as they're trying to study, and it's injuring their eyes, or they're burning wood or burning coal. And you have an opportunity instead to have this access to power, which actually is a win-win, because we produce clean burning power. We certainly, in hydro, if you ever did the Inga Dam project, you could electrify all of West Africa off of that project. So these kinds of initiatives, get them involved in places where they can make a difference. We have another initiative that I wrote with another member. I'm the co-chairman of the Conservation Caucus. And this particular bill protects landscapes, just as like Teddy Roosevelt did here in the United States. Protects 7 landscapes across Africa. But we need civil society in order to make certain it's enforced, in order to make certain that no head of state doesn't try to sole contract with a government overseas to come in and clear cut all the timber in the national park system and allow poaching and all the rest of it. We keep a handle on this by having people engaged to continually put pressure to solve these problems. And lastly, this idea of communicating information, which I started with. Look at what worked. What did change the system in the Soviet Union? If you talk to Václav Havel or Lech Walesa, they'll say the broadcasts had an enormous impact. Because when we could hear young Poles or young Czechs, I was in East Germany on an exchange program years ago, and I remember the impact of those broadcasts on East Germans. They said, oh, those old West German broadcasts were very bombastic, but these broadcasts that are coming in about political pluralism and tolerance, market economy, freedom, they're changing everybody's viewpoint about this totalitarian regime. And if you get the change from 65% of the people being upset with a totalitarian system, and you drive that to 85%, well, that's what happened across Eastern Europe. That's what happened in the former Soviet Union. The difference is we're not doing it today. I have legislation to do that, myself and Elliot Engel, my ranking Democratic member. That bill is over in the Senate now, and I would suggest it would be a great cause for young people to be involved in. Familiarize yourself with what works. It's not a confrontational way to engage in foreign policy, but information that's true, that's legit, about what's actually going on in your society and going on in the world on a daily basis by stringers that come from that country that have the pulse. That is what can change the course of the future to bring that stability we want to see around the world, but also that opportunity we want to see for the next generations there and here. So we can put information out around the world and we can change the history of human events. And all it takes is us to keep our eye on that target. Let's just agree, and let's try to get those who are leading us on policy to understand. The United States should be speaking with one voice. When we do, look, you and I all remember the Cold War. I certainly remember it. I remember what East Germany looked like. Who thought we'd see that wall come down? And with a little bit of vision, you know, and with Reagan pushing those policies, it not only came down, but the consequences were to advance human liberty, you know, forward. And so let's get back to what works in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of the broadcasting. My bill would put a CEO in charge of that operation. Right now, it is controlled by a bunch of directors who are voluntary, who never make a quorum and never make a decision. Let's give them the original mission that they were given in the 80s. Let's consolidate Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, et cetera, all into one broadcasting platform. Let's get back to what worked. And let's do it together, and the future will be bright if we can work together to achieve the goal of more human freedom around the world. Don't discount how far we've come. Thank you.
The Orange County Forum is brought to you through the generous support of the Orange County Register and our sustaining partners. For more information about the Orange County Forum, call 949-588-9884. The Orange County Forum is a nonprofit organization. Your contributions are tax deductible.